I'd like to welcome everyone. This is the Institute of Risk Management's Cyber Group webinar. We're going to be talking about Zero Trust by Dr. Lee Newcombe. Next slide, please. Before we get going on Zero Trust, I just wanted to say a few words about the IRM and our group. These are some of the past events that are available on the web, and this presentation will also be available in a few days' time. I invite you to take a look at these if you missed them or just want to recap. They are useful resources. And I will also drop a link into the chat shortly that will take you to the special interest group cyber webpage, where you can find some of this stuff as well. Next page, please. I'd like to introduce you to the team and also take this opportunity to thank them for their volunteering contributions to make events like this happen. If anyone visiting as a participant would like to get involved in our cyber group, it's pretty unique kind of group compared to other cyber professional groups, simply because we tend to have a less technical focus as part of our risk conversation. You can reach out and connect via our LinkedIn group on the slide at the bottom, or individually on our profiles. The cyber group does provide excellent networking opportunities with people that you simply do not get exposure to in our other professional circles. And it can help facilitate your personal development if you have such goals. Next slide. And finally, a little bit about the IRM. So we're a global organisation of over 8,000 risk professionals. The IRM is now coupled with the IOR, which is the Institute of Operational Risk. It's a well-established and looked upon by industry as a thought leader in risk management. So we offer a range of certifications and training and support risk practitioners' development through a combination of knowledge sharing and networking. And I would recommend membership if you work as a professional risk practitioner. Bit of a tongue twister there. Next slide, please. So in terms of any questions that may crop up during the presentation, please drop them into the chat. There'll be some natural pause points to provide an opportunity to have these answered. And finally, I'll remind again at the end of the presentation, but we have a Survey Monkey link, and I would really urge you to please take a minute as soon as you can after the event to provide us some feedback, as it helps us improve and better tailor what we do for our audience. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'm now delighted to pass you over to Lee Newcombe, who will share his thoughts and views on Zero Trust. Lee, thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and I'll hand over duties for letting people into the room. So I am here today to talk about Zero Trust. As Alex mentioned there will be some natural pauses in the presentation as we go, so do please get some questions into the chat box. I would be delighted if we can make this quite interactive in terms of having it as a conversation, as well as me battering you with PowerPoint slides. So the agenda for today, 3 main areas. Introductions. So what is Zero Trust? We've been talking about Zero Trust quite a lot over the last couple of years, but lots of people have different views on what Zero Trust means. So it is quite important that we agree on a set of terminology for it. Secondly, why have we been talking about Zero Trust quite so much over the last couple of years? So why the fuss about Zero Trust? What are the drivers that are making organizations think about adopting Zero Trust? And then finally, it's kind of nice that we security professionals talk about Zero Trust, but what's actually happening in the real world. So there will be an example organization that I've worked with, and we can talk about how Zero Trust is the right answer for them, and also some lessons learned from trying to adopt Zero Trust approaches in the real world. Who am I, and why did Alex invite me along? This is me. Been working in security since 1998. Spent a lot of time working in cloud security, particularly from around 2009 onwards. But most importantly for today, I am Capgemini's global service owner for Zero Trust. despite the fact that my logo appears in the top right-hand corner on all these slides, don't worry, this will not be a sales session. This is purely me talking around Zero Trust. So why are we talking about Zero Trust? Well, if you've been on any security webinars or risk webinars over the last few years, you'll have heard folks like me talking about why the traditional security model is broken. That traditional model of a castle and moat or hard shell and soft center just doesn't work in the modern collaborative environment, particularly when we start thinking about cloud being business as usual as well. There isn't a nice, easily defined network perimeter for what is on the inside and what is on the outside. And in fact, I tend to argue that that distinction between inside and outside is somewhat arbitrary these days. We work with partners in complex supply chains. We are on-prem, on cloud, on software as a service. There is no easily defined perimeter. Post-COVID, post-pandemic, our staff like to work from anywhere. They could be working in the office, they could be working at home, they could be on the road, they could be enjoying a nice coffee in a canteen with a suitably screen protector enabled laptop. But the key there is no matter where these folks are, they need access to their business data and their business applications. So we need a way to support that. And then at the last piece there, it wouldn't be a security presentation without at least a little bit of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And this is where we start talking about ransomware. We are still seeing lots of ransomware out there. The recent issue with the MoveIt file transfer solution has seen a few high-profile organizations suffering from ransomware. And the problem there goes back to that traditional model of hard shell, soft center. If you do get an attacker on the inside, what are the mechanisms that will stop them from spreading throughout your environment? And if it is ransomware, what will stop them from being able to encrypt all of your sensitive data? Of course, with ransomware these days, it does tend to be a dual threat because they will exfiltrate their data first before they encrypt it, just so that they have that potential of extortion as well as ransom. Of course, what goes around comes around. Zero Trust is quite a high-profile buzzword at the moment, but it has been around for quite a long time. So as you can see at the bottom left there, the Zero Trust term first came out around 1994, when a PhD student coined the term in his PhD thesis on formalizing trust in IT systems. 2004 was an important year because that was when the Jericho Forum, which is now part of the Open Group, introduced the concept of deperimeterization. This caused quite a bit of fuss at the time when people was thinking that meant get rid of all your firewalls. Didn't quite mean that, but it was all about enabling organizations to better collaborate and recognizing that there is that need there to enable that sharing and collaboration. Another important date, 2010. This is where a sizable part of the security community will say that Zero Trust was invented. This was when John Kindervag, who was at Forrester at the time, again recoined the term Zero Trust, which started us on the journey that we're on at the moment. And then 2014 was when Google pushed their Beyond Corp model and white papers into the public domain. So this is where Google was making their business systems accessible over the internet and essentially part of the internet. And they very kindly then pushed all that information into the public domain. And again, if you talk to lots of folks, folks will say that Beyond Corp invented Zero Trust. Then we get to 2020. And this is where I think things started to get properly mature, was when NIST published SP 800-207. And you might see that cropping up again a few times in this presentation. So NIST being the National Institute for Standards and Technology over in the US, a standards body, and they produced this Zero Trust architecture paper. Now, the nice thing about the NIST definition is that it is vendor and technology agnostic. As you can imagine, looking through this timeline, lots of vendors have their own views on Zero Trust. Lots of analysts have their own views on zero trust. It is important to have that technology agnostic, vendor agnostic perspective, which is where NIST and their sister agency, CISA, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, come in. And I will be talking about those in a little while. If we're going to talk about zero trust, then we need to have that common view of what it is. And this is as technical as my presentation gets. So this one builds a little bit. So this looks like a fairly traditional security model at this point. On the left-hand side, you have a subject. That subject could be a human user like you or I. It could be a workload like a virtual machine or a container or an application. It could even be a device. That might be a big, heavy machine in a factory. It might be something as simple as my little fitness tracker on my wrist. But that wants to access a resource on the right-hand side. So that could be a business application, could be business data, but somewhere in the middle is a policy enforcement point which says yes or no, you can access it or you can't. So to make that a little bit more real, we have a user, we have an application, and in between that user and the application is a firewall. So in the traditional model, what might happen is I might wake up in the morning, turn my laptop on, and want to access the application on the right-hand side. I will log into the VPN. The firewall will let me through, and then I have access all day towards that application, that business data. So just kind of a one-time check, and that simple firewall check in the middle. There are a few issues with that, particularly if, for example, my laptop has been compromised, or somebody else has stolen my password and is masquerading as my good self, or maybe the resource itself ends up being compromised. And because we are maybe using that hard shell, soft center approach, once that application has been compromised, that has carte blanche to roam throughout the data center. So we need a new way of doing things, which is where zero trust comes in. Now, lots of acronyms on this one. Primarily because I am borrowing these terms directly from that NIST standard. When you see things like CDM, that refers to continuing monitoring and diagnostics. So if you start thinking about your laptop, you'll have lots of security agents on there. So maybe things like CrowdStrike or Defender that monitor the status of your laptop to make sure it's fully up to date with patches, that you have all the security software on there that is being expected. Those kind of tools give you context about the device that you're accessing from. Other sources of context, things like threat intelligence. Are there any new vulnerabilities out there on the ports or applications that you're looking to access? And then also SIEM and user analytics. So are you accessing those systems in the way that you normally access them? If you normally access in office hours, and then all of a sudden you're accessing at midnight from a country on the opposite side of the world from where you normally access it, and you're suddenly trying to access all the HR and finance systems and you're a developer, maybe there's something slightly odd happening. So that's where those analytics things come in as well. So the key point around this is it is context-based. You have all this context about where are you accessing it from? Who are you in terms of your authentication status? Are you accessing systems in line with your normal behavior? The other key thing about this is it's not done once at the start of the day. Ideally, this will be done on every single access request towards that application or data, so that if something changes during the course of your session, maybe whilst you're accessing this business application, you have another browser window open and you're being conned into visiting a malicious website that takes hold of your browser, you can still then provide some protection against whoever it is that's now in control of your browser, because these checks are taking place on that dynamic basis. It is context-based. And I mentioned earlier on, assume compromise. You have to assume that either the user's credentials have been compromised, the device they're accessing on might have been compromised, the network they're coming in over may have been compromised. So it's all about building up sufficient trust from that position of zero trust to enable folks to access those resources securely. So that is the key difference there between zero trust and traditional models. You're assuming everything is broken. The access checks are dynamic on a per request basis, and it's based on context. the scope of zero trust is wide, and that's why I borrowed this diagram here. So this diagram here is taken from the CISA Zero Trust Maturity model. Some key things to note here, just as the span of technology involved. So identity, lots of people like to talk about identity as the new perimeter. It's certainly part of the perimeter, but zero trust isn't just about identity. We have devices in there. In the scope of the CISA model, that device would tend to be your laptop or your mobile phone. In terms of the way that I sometimes interpret that, I push that out towards operational technology and IoT as well, because we need devices have identities too. I mentioned networks. You will find that lots of people like to talk about ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Access. That is certainly part of Zero Trust, but there is more to Zero Trust than just ZTNA. So I like to talk about Zero Trust architectures, which includes ZTNA. Applications and workloads. I mentioned earlier on when we start thinking about subjects, we could be talking about virtual machines, we could be talking about containers, we could be talking about applications. All of these things also have identities. All of these things can be compromised. All of these things need to have their access controlled. They're all subject to zero trust. And of course, data. At the end of the day, that's kind of what we're here to protect. Is the data, the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of that data. So it's all about making sure that we give the right entities access to the right data. That's all fine and dandy from that technology perspective. But then we have the foundations that underlie that. Visibility and analytics. If we're making all of these dynamic, context-based access control decisions, we need to base those decisions on smart signals. Are we getting the right signals from our technology to let us know that the context that they're providing us with is genuine and sufficient to allow us to grant access? Automation and orchestration. This is where the real brains of zero trust sits and where the magic sits. Something somewhere has to take hold of all those signals and then weight those different signals and decide that sufficient trust has been granted to enable the access to proceed. Then underneath that, governance. Conscious of my audience, the governance side is going to be key to all of this because responsibilities are changing. If you have an old school model where the network team is the custodian of your environment, those responsibilities are being kind of lifted a little bit off the network folks, because the network should now just be about transport, with security elements being spread throughout those 5 pillars there: identity, device, networks, workloads, and data. So you're distributing your security controls, which means you're distributing the responsibility for those security controls. And it's not a trivial exercise, and you need to bring the stakeholders along with you on that journey, because those responsibilities do change. Some folks may not like responsibilities being taken away. Some folks may not like responsibilities being added. Lots of words on this slide. I would recommend a read of NIST SP 800-207. If you cast your mind back to around maybe 2009, 2010, when cloud first came on the scene, we saw lots of different vendors start putting cloud in front of everything that they do. We used to call it cloud washing. So it used to be a file transfer mechanism. Now it's a cloud file transfer mechanism. And it's that kind of cloud washing that we saw. Now we do see something kind of similar with zero trust. Zero trust is an important philosophy in terms of securing our systems. However, it is not the only way to secure our systems. So it may be that your particular use cases, you don't need zero trust. That's a perfectly valid response. What frustrates me sometimes is when vendors and analysts call everything zero trust, despite the fact it doesn't necessarily follow the key tenets. And those key tenets that I've pulled out on this one, because for me, and you'll probably hear these terms a lot more throughout the rest of our session as well, assume breach, dynamic, and context-based authentication. So if we're going to start talking about what zero trust is, it has to follow those 3 key messages, those 3 key aspects in order to be properly zero trust, in my opinion. So that's the first of my natural breaks. Do we have any questions about what zero trust is?
Surely, thank you very much. We have a few questions which were raised prior to our webinar. So I would like to just to start from the first one. Does real zero trust adoption mean a complete ICT system re-architecture? Do you have to completely start over again?
Well, that is a fine question, and we will talk on some of that stuff later on. It is a lot more straightforward to do zero trust in a greenfield environment than to retrofit it to legacy environments. And I will talk, as I say, about that a little bit more later on. But also what you can do is base it on specific use cases. So we've got those different 5 pillars that we went through there in terms of identity, devices, workloads, etc. We can phase those and deliver those in a proper program. I would certainly not recommend trying to do this big bang. We will want to identify the use cases. We will want to identify the scope, perhaps starting with some critical applications first and then pushing it out more widely. I would not be recommending somebody just throws away everything they've got and try to do a complete re-architecture of zero trust over the course of a couple of months. It is a proper program of work. What I would certainly recommend is folks building new cloud environments, new hybrid environments, doing some kind of cloud migration, get the zero trust principles built in from the outset.
Sure, thank you very much. We have one more question from our participant. Does zero trust approach cost more in terms of controls, and does it outweigh the benefits sometimes?
There are lots of different ways of delivering zero trust. So conscious I'm not in a sales mission, but I will just give one of the ways of doing it because it does directly answer that question. So if you want to use a technology like Zscaler to do zero trust, you're actually simplifying your estate because Zscaler sits between yourself and the systems you're accessing in the middle. But what it enables you to do is retire lots of your legacy on-premises data center security because that's all now being provided by Zscaler. It also helps you to simplify your network because you don't need VPNs anymore. So there is a fairly robust cost savings argument for using technologies like Zscaler. Conversely, if you adopt different technologies, they will have different pros and cons, but they may not enable you to retire some of your legacy data center stack, but they may offer different benefits. So it is very much a horses for courses, how long is a piece of string type answer, but there are trade-offs. And I think that's always going to be the case with cyber and indeed with risk in general. There is always a degree of trade-off.
Thank you, Lee. I think I will leave some other questions at the end. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Next bit then. So why are we talking about zero trust at this point? Oops, sorry, gone too far. It's not just a theoretical conversation. There are lots of organizations actually going ahead and doing this stuff at the moment. That actually includes my own organization. We are doing zero trust to ourselves. And this is because, as I went through some of those use cases earlier on, we need to support our users wherever they may be. So just a few statistics there in terms of why folks are moving towards zero trust at this point. But this is the important bit. So these are the different use cases that we're seeing organizations move towards zero trust in order to support. So that you work from anywhere. We do need to give people access to their business applications and data wherever they may be. But it also helps with removing some friction from the users when they're accessing the services that they need. Because by going towards zero trust, we can also move towards things like passwordless authentication. We don't necessarily need to worry about VPNs anymore. So it just actually makes life easier for the users. And from a security perspective, that's great because ideally, security should be transparent. We don't want to get in the way. We want to let people do their job properly and securely. I mentioned secure cloud migration. Because we are, in general, moving the controls closer to the data and the assets, it doesn't really matter where the data and the assets are because we can apply the same philosophy towards control of access to those assets. So it's a nice way of trying to remove those differences between on-prem and on-cloud from a security perspective. So it's a single philosophy across wherever the data and the assets may reside. And we can also use these technologies to control access to things like SaaS services as well. So there's always a focus on cloud, on infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Sometimes SaaS is the forgotten relation, but we can also apply the Zero Trust philosophy to SaaS services. We do also need to protect devices. So devices have identities too. So we can use this to protect OT. And we talk quite a lot about OT-IT convergence. And again, we can apply Zero Trust philosophies and approaches and technologies towards securing OT and IoT devices. So making sure that machines can only talk to the machines that they need to talk to, making sure that they can only reach out to the internet and pull firmware updates from the locations where they're supposed to be pulling those updates from, making sure that the admin folks who need to get in and maintain those devices are the right admin folks coming in to maintain those devices. So there are quite a few different OT security use cases that we need to worry about from a Zero Trust perspective. But one of those is making sure that machines can only talk to the machines that they should be talking to so that we can limit the blast radius of any compromise. Speaking of blast radius, we usually use that term when it comes to workload interactions. So we need to make sure that we limit the impact of compromise. So if a virtual machine gets compromised, you're only at risk of losing the machines that those virtual machines can talk to rather than your entire environment. So with Zero Trust, we can segment the environment up so that VMs can only talk to the VMs they want to talk to. If we want more granular control, we can control containers. And if you want even more granular control, we can talk about applications and ports and APIs as well, so that only the right folks and APIs can call the APIs that they need to do their job. But this helps us with that ransomware problem that I mentioned at the start. Because all of this stuff is modern and we start talking about cloud and other such things that can be defined in code, we can now define our security as code as well, which means it's easier to automate, easier to deploy, and easier to control, because we can use the same kind of source control systems that we use for application code for controlling the state of our security code and control as well. So we may not have a nice, easily network definable security perimeter, but we can define our perimeter as in software as code. I did say I was going to be talking about some of those key challenges towards adoption. So lack of understanding. I have mentioned this a few times now. There have been a lot of iterations of Zero Trust. There are lots of definitions of Zero Trust. Vendors have them, analysts have them. The folks that the senior stakeholders talk to will have their own definitions as well. So good idea to focus on those NIST definitions because they are vendor agnostic. And that will help to make sure that when you're having conversations about Zero Trust in your organizations, that they're all based on the same understanding. That's also important from a scoping perspective as well. Going back to your conversation, that question about, do you want to kind of throw away the old world and join the new from a Zero Trust perspective? Agree the vision. You need to have that common vision of what folks are looking to achieve via a move towards Zero Trust. And that's part of the job of those driving the Zero Trust initiatives, is to make sure there is that agreed vision, that everybody understands what is meant by Zero Trust and which parts of the organization will be affected. Speaking about affecting parts of the organization, there is that cultural change part of it as well. If folks are comfortable and used to that old school model of a hard shell and a soft center, it can be hard to get them to accept that their applications and data now effectively reside on the internet to some respects, with some versions of Zero Trust, particularly the Google Beyond Court model. So there is a degree of going out there and building that consensus that it's the right thing to do, and then making sure that folks are comfortable with the changes and responsibility that go along with that wider transformation. And of course, you are introducing new technologies, so there will be a whole set of training to go along with that introduction as well, to make sure that we're using those tools and technologies appropriately. And then that legacy change is difficult. when you talk with lots of organizations, you will find that they have that soft center, that they don't necessarily have a lot of segregation on the inside of their firewall. And that means that all their applications are used to talking to everything that they need to be able to talk to and more. When we start adding segmentation into those flat networks, that means that we're stopping applications from talking to applications, or maybe not being able to access the data centers and databases that they should be accessing. And when applications stop being able to talk to other applications, they get a little bit upset, and then so do the business owners of those applications. So we need to manage any kind of implementation of Zero Trust quite carefully so that we minimize that risk of outages. So any questions on why folks are moving towards Zero Trust?
So Lee, there was another question that came in earlier, probably one of the principles of adoption. So the question is, does the transition back to flexible or hybrid working affect the efficacy of Zero Trust analysis of users due to varying locations and patterns of working?
It is a key driver for folks moving towards Zero Trust, is that ability to support users wherever they may be. And actually, for some organizations in the old world as well, you will find that they will have some geographical restrictions. So, for example, I'm aware of some financial services organizations where certain systems can only be accessed from certain rooms within secure premises. And we can look to try and get away from some of those restrictions by adopting Zero Trust approaches, because now it's more context-based rather than geographical-based. The key thing for me in those kind of discussions is remembering the availability part of security. Sometimes we're quite focused on confidentiality and integrity, and that can get in the way of availability. So, for example, if you did have that kind of geographical restriction, i.e. you can only support a set server from a set room, if you can't get into that room for some reason, then all of a sudden you have a bit of a problem. So from an availability perspective, you might be better to have a different set of controls rather than just being in that geographical location, which is where Zero Trust can come in, because we can base those controls around context in terms of the device you're using and where you are and who you are and the roles you've got and the attributes you've got and the nature of the systems that you're accessing. So it is a really good way of trying to provide the same level of security outcome, but not necessarily using the same set of controls.
Thanks. Given the audience that we've got here as well, what's the headline risk statement to senior leaders as to how you'd get buy-in for Zero Trust adoption?
So one is the thing we've just been speaking about in terms of improved user experience. The second one is the ransomware problem. So how can you segment your systems so that you're not going to find yourself completely owned by a single incident? So that is another strong one. So the risk reduction question. And the third one is around transformation and being able to support that migration towards cloud. So having a security model that is appropriate for the modern ways of working. So those are the three main ones. And that third one on transformation, although it sounds a little bit woolly, if you consider some old school environments where they are based on network segmentation and air gaps, you might find that they get in the way of some of the transformation activities that people want to do when it comes to pushing code into production. And again, that's where Zero Trust can help, and you can actually help speed up that kind of adoption of new ways of working. So efficiencies, user access, cloud migration, DevSecOps, and then risk reduction. Reduce your risk of a catastrophic ransomware incident.
Lee, we have one more question. Are there any known faults with Zero Trust approach? Can it be exploited in a new or different way by hackers or bad actors?
There are always flaws in security technologies. So one way of viewing Zero Trust is to think about Zero Trust as an evolution of defense in depth, which means that if one of your security controls does get bypassed, then there are still some other controls that may step in to stop the attacker in their tracks. So an example might be with some of the implementations of the authentication authorization protocols. So things like OAuth is a authorization protocol. If somebody gets hold of a token, they may be able to reuse it in some circumstances. That could be catastrophic if you don't have that whole set of context-based systems in place that we discussed at the start. So, for example, if you do have a compromised authentication token and that starts doing things that are out of the ordinary, then you would hope that your behavioral anomaly detection systems would spot that. Similarly, if that token had been used in one location, then all of a sudden it's been used in another location, again, the context-based controls should catch it. So yes, there will always be weaknesses in certain elements of your zero trust solution because it's technology and there's weaknesses in every technology, but the entire point of this is that you do have that defense in depth and those compensating controls to spot it. So overall, you should be in a better position to prevent, detect, and respond to security incidents.
Thank you, Lee. Just one more question, please. Is zero trust still worthwhile? Sorry, I just to someone to. Okay, thank you. I will repeat. Is zero trust still worthwhile once quantum computers are being used by attackers?
Yes, I think it is. So quantum, I think, will typically come in when you start thinking about encryption and being able to rapidly refactor and be able to break things like public key encryption. So there are quantum resistant encryption algorithms coming out at the moment, so we can adopt those for encrypting the comms between the users, well, the subjects or the endpoints and the resources they're accessing. So there will still be ways to encrypt that stuff. NIST have approved a variety of algorithms now that are quantum resistant, although predominantly those are more around signatures than encryption. But I think there is one that has been approved now for encryption as well. So we can still encrypt stuff, which is where the quantum threat will come in. So yes, I think zero trust is still going to be the way to go, even with quantum coming up, threatening all of our encryption. And actually, my example client that's coming up, that threat of quantum was one of the things we had to consider.
Thank you. We can continue. So maybe we can ask some other questions. That's it. Thank you.
You can. This is the third and final part of my presentation. So again, just trying to make this thing feel a little bit more real. So this is a client that we were working with towards the end of last year. Was a global organization, so they do have folks working everywhere, particularly post-pandemic. So this ties in directly with the conversation we've been having about enabling end users and user transparency and making their life easier. You can also see why I started talking about speed of delivery being constrained by legacy network-centric air-gapped controls. So they have lots of traditional breakpoints between their environments of dev, test, production, etc., which made their life quite hard in terms of their wider strategic imperative to speed time to market and delivery. They are also moving from a fairly traditional on-premises data center based environment towards something a little bit more public cloud based. Even on-prem, however, they are adopting lots of containers, so lots of Kubernetes and things, and they are looking to adopt cloud-like ways of working even on-prem. So they needed a security mechanism and security philosophy that could support that. Ransomware was a key threat for these folks. Whilst they do have strong separation between their different environments, within those environments, the separation isn't quite so strong. So when if somebody could get on the inside of one of those environments, there would be limited options for preventing them to spread. And finally, because they do have that air gap separation between lots of their environments, they have users with multiple identities. which again isn't great from a user experience perspective. That's lots of usernames and passwords to remember and change. So there was a good opportunity there for identity consolidation. So this is just an example of an organization that should be, and in this case are, thinking about adopting zero trust. So if your organization has some of these issues, then maybe it's something that you should be thinking about doing as well in terms of moving towards that zero trust philosophy. What are some of the lessons learned that we've seen from clients who have adopted zero trust? Well, firstly, buy-in is key. We have discussed a few times now the scope of zero trust and how wide-ranging that is across the organization, both in terms of technology and governance and the change in roles and responsibilities. You do need senior stakeholders to buy into any kind of zero trust adoption and program so that they can push that down throughout the organization and just make them realize that this change is coming and it will happen. One way of obtaining that buy-in is to show them the new world. So show them that new improved user journey and user experience. Show them what the new world looks like, and that will help to convince them that this is the way to go. I may have come across as being a little bit vendor bashing during the course of this presentation in terms of the talk about everybody having their own definition of zero trust. But this is a key point, is when you are going to go down that zero trust journey, make sure you know what it is that you as the organization, as the customer, wants to do. What are the use cases you want to support? What are the outcomes that you need to deliver? And then go off there and find the right vendors to deliver those outcomes and those use cases. One risk that you can find is if you engage with certain vendors too soon, they'll be pushing you towards their vision of zero trust, which may or may not be the same as your own. So know what it is you want to do first, then go off and try and do it rather than necessarily be driven by the vendors. I've spoken a few times now about those governance changes and the roles and responsibility changes. Don't think that zero trust is just a question of technology. It isn't. So do think about those transformation costs in terms of changes to your target operating model, changes to training requirements, etc. Those will all have to be paid for at some point. And as hopefully has been become clear during the course of the presentation, it's not necessarily a trivial enterprise at the enterprise scale. If you are changing everything that you do, then it will be a multi-year journey. And also you will encounter skeletons along the way. We are looking at everything that you have, all of your devices, all of your networks, all of your applications, all of your users. It is not uncommon to find out that what we see in the real world may not match what is documented in the enterprise architecture documentation. So don't be surprised to find a few things coming up that you perhaps didn't expect. But if you're going to do zero trust across your users, your workloads, and your devices, be prepared for a multi-year journey if you are a fairly large organization. So to summarize, what is zero trust? It is that way to move the security controls closer to the resources. You have to assume that everything is broken. So assume breach. Your user credentials are out there. Your application security keys are out there. Your laptop has been compromised. Assume breach. Your security checks are dynamic. You're doing it on a per request basis. If not per request, then per session, so that if something does break whilst you're online, you can still identify that and do something to prevent a wider incident. And it is context-based. We are making access control decisions based on who you are, where you are, what you do, what your device is, and what kind of resource it is that you're trying to access. So it's context-based, dynamic, and we are assuming breach. Why is it right for everybody to be looking at this at the moment? Everybody talks about security as an enabler. With zero trust, it really is an enabler. We can get security out of the way of your end users. Don't have to worry about VPNs. May not have to worry about passwords. Improved user experience. It is about risk reduction. So have that segmentation in place, reduce the blast radius. Bad things will happen. Let's try and contain those bad things as much as we can do. And going back to Alex's question that he raised earlier on around, it is ideal for hybrid IT ecosystems. So cloud is business as usual. We do have systems and data everywhere. The zero trust philosophy is the right way to approach securing that. But how do we go about preparing to move organizations to that? Going back to that point I made earlier on, you do need to set those expectations and agree the vision. So what is it that we're looking at? Are we just looking at users? Are we just looking at users accessing high-risk applications? Are we looking at the entire environment? Are we starting with cloud? Are we starting with on-prem? You need to get that vision agreed and then get the stakeholders to buy into it and then push that down throughout their organization. And also those clearly defined outcomes. How are we going to measure success? What does a successful zero trust solution look like? And I think, again, that will tend to come back down to those things like user experience and agility. And that was the last thing I wanted to say about zero trust. So this is my third and final break for questions. So any more questions out there?
Surely. Thank you so much for such a great presentation. We have a few questions, so let me start from the first one. Can you still claim zero trust if you are using products that are out of support?
Legacy is an interesting area. There are ways to tackle legacy. But what I would probably suggest is thinking about isolating legacy technologies where you can do and trying to put some controls around that legacy environment. It's problematic if you have legacy technology that maybe can't support some of the agents we might be looking to install, which is also something that we see with kind of OT as well with devices, because we can't traditionally go in there and install a new agent on a big machine in a factory. We sometimes have to put controls around it. So if you can segregate out and put controls around legacy, that's the better way to do it. I think that's probably the best place for me to stop on that one.
Thank you, Lee. Next question, how do security team resourcing requirements change with zero trust adoption?
Oh, that's an interesting one. It comes back down to that point about changing the responsibilities. So it really depends upon how your organization is currently structured. So you might see less of a focus on network security, more of a focus moving towards the application layer. So if we're doing things like workload segmentation, then we need folks who understand how those workloads work. So what applications do need to talk to other applications? How do they need to talk to those applications? What data do they need to access? All of that stuff will take resources to understand. So there may be a rejigging of resources across the team in terms of who's now responsible for security and what they need to understand. What I would also say is that some of the technologies will change. So because we are dealing with the context now, so we need to understand more about the device. So that will necessitate more maybe endpoint security agents if you don't currently have them. Most folks will already have something like a CrowdStrike or a Defender on there, but if you don't, then there'll probably be a need to have something like that. But also when it comes to development and in-house development, there is a really good opportunity here to embed the telemetry that we need to make smart access control decisions. So if you have an in-house development team, hopefully they're doing everything security by design, they have their threat models, they have the opportunity to code security events of interest into the applications that they're developing, and then we can use those for smart access control decisions. So we can hopefully get some security resources into those development teams to make sure that they're generating the right signals for us. And at the end of the day, the hope is that because we're doing all this smartly, there will be less of a need for quite so much by way of instant response.
Thank you, Lee. Another question, do organizations develop zero trust policy documents?
Yep, there will need to be zero trust policy documents. There will also need to be that informed view of what we mean by sufficient trust and trust metrics. So because everything is context-based, some things will matter more than others. So when you're making your access control decisions, you will have your context on your device status, your location, your user. Each of these things will have different weightings, and you need within the organization to agree which metrics it is that you're using for your access control decisions and which ones are most important for certain use cases as well. So that will all be driven via policy.
Great, thank you. One more question. Can the contextual user behavioral information capture run into problems arising from personal privacy regulation?
Yes, is the short answer to that one, particularly in certain geographies. So if you're looking at places like Germany, for example, that are very strict in terms of those privacy aspects, it can perhaps run into more problems than in locations where there's not quite so much of a focus on personal privacy. It comes back to that question about context, scope, and weightings. So we may be able to derive some behavioral analytics things that do not impinge on privacy quite so much, but that will be dependent upon organizational context. And I think that's one of the key things to bear in mind with zero trust is your trust metrics, your weightings will differ per organization and per system within that organization as well, potentially. So there is a degree of effort involved in putting that context into place. I don't think it's like a firewall where you can just turn up, put a firewall in there, and it's kind of straightforward as to what should come in and come out. There is a bit more effort involved in getting the right security in the right places when it comes to zero trust.
Surely, thank you very much. Another one, our business work with many external third parties who need access to customer data due to the nature of our services. How do we ensure the version of zero trust is trust or of the same standard as ours? Yeah.
Wow, that is again an interesting question. So we have to, I think, split out the technology side from the governance and legal side of that one. So you can place contractual controls on your third parties that they should be doing things properly, but once the information, I'm kind of just stepping back for a second to think about how I phrase this. There are different ways of doing it. So if you have information rights management systems in place, so data is one of the pillars in that zero trust model. You can use things like information rights management to control how your data is used, even by third parties. So there is that kind of technical control available to you to control how your data is used and protected. But I think with third parties, what you'll typically find is that will come down to contractual flow downs, that they should be holding your data in the way that you are content for them to do so, in combination with the usual assurance mechanisms that you're all familiar with in terms of security certifications. That would be the typical way of controlling that with third parties in terms of once they have your data, what can they do with it? I think there are two sides of it. There is that once they have your data, what can they do with it versus your control of their access to your data whilst it's still in your control. The latter one we can certainly help with via zero trust because we can place certain controls on people that we know are third parties, because that's part of the context that we use to make access control decisions. The more interesting part is once they have your data, is that still in your control because it's subject to information rights management, or is that out of your control and it's now down to contractual trust?
Thank you very much, Lee. The next one, do you see the EU mandating zero trust in the same way the US has?
I don't know the answer to that question, actually. I haven't thought that one through. The Biden mandate was important, I think, from a zero trust perspective, because it will force the vendors to adopt NIST terminology. Because the US has got a big wallet. If vendors want to sell into the US, then they're going to have to adopt that similar kind of terminology. I haven't seen a EU mandate yet. In the UK, the NCSC and others are promoting zero trust, but the NCSC in places like that in the UK don't mandate anymore. They just provide guidance and guidelines. So it is being encouraged in the UK. I suspect when we start looking at EU and what is happening around resilience and DORA and things like that, that zero trust may become a supporting mechanism to deliver those requirements. But I haven't seen a mandate from EU to adopt zero trust. Doesn't mean it's not out there. I'm not going to claim I know everything at this point.
No problem. Thank you very much, Lee. Just one more question. Does a per request approach add too big an overhead in operating zero trust?
In some circumstances, the latency requirements will mean that you go to a per session basis. I think as a philosophical point, ideally we'll go per request where we can do. If we're dealing with low latency, kind of high frequency transactions, then it may have to be per session. I think the key point about all of this stuff is we have to be pragmatic and realistic. So we know what the philosophy is, we know what the principle is, but in some cases, reality will intervene and we have to make compromises.
Thanks. I'll interject now if that's okay, Zena, because we're almost out of time. So I do have one more question, and maybe you've answered it already. So from my perspective, working in IT and security, with a zero trust philosophy, does it mean that you can host data in a hostile environment, or are there still areas of zero trust which are complete no-nos?
What's your appetite for risk?
So that's what
It's going to be the answer to that one, because going back to that point about information rights management, there are controls we can put around data so that only folks with the right key can access it, at which point theoretically we don't care where that data is because it's encrypted. So that is the technical response. The more realistic response from dealing with organizations is, what is your appetite for risk?
Okay. Well, I'd really like to say thank you to you, Lee, for taking the time and trouble to talk about zero trust to us. I'm just going to drop in the chat, as I've previously stated, I would really appreciate people just taking a minute to complete our survey. And yeah, I think we'll call it there. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you very much, Lee.